Global Studies here at Boston University. Welcome to the third in our series of special events for Alumni Weekend, Boston University's Alumni Weekend, that we are calling World in Flux. We met here on Friday to talk about the world in flux in terms of the future of global politics. On Saturday, we discussed the world in flux in terms of the future of global economics and the global economy. And today I am joined by my colleagues from the Pardee School, from across the school, and we're going to talk about the future of global values. And we're going to continue this conversation that we've had in the last two. We are delighted to have you here. Let me first very briefly introduce my panel today. My colleagues who are joining me today are Professor Rachel Brule, Professor Tim Longman, Professor Adela Panetta, and Professor Mike Woldemariam. And I'll tell you more about them, and they'll be talking more to you about it on this broad question of how is the world in flux? What should we expect? What should we be concerned about in terms of the societal? We've talked about the political, the economic, but the societal challenges, tensions that we face in the world COVID is creating and beyond. As before we start, let me introduce a series that we've been doing at one of our centers, the Pardee Center for the Study of the Longer Range Future, which since March has been talking to experts around the world, leaders, major thinkers, scholars, policy practitioners, politicians, and asking them what they think the world after COVID might look like. And in some ways, to give a background to our conversation, let me show you a very short, just about 2 minutes, just over 2 minutes clip of some of the things we heard when we asked them that question about rights.
What I'm hoping is for people to look very clearly at the COVID disparities, for people to even look at the disparities in police violence, and to realize there's only really two causes. Either there's a problem with people, there's a problem with certain groups being better or worse, or it's the result of policy, of bad policy.
All of these natural disasters, pandemics, have a significant class and race aspect. There is no scenario that I can imagine in which this pandemic won't constitute a serious push factor throughout the global south.
I do think social movements form in relationship to injustices. And the hope, I think, emerges precisely as the links of solidarity expand, and as you realize that your sense of what the world should look like, both morally and politically, is shared by others. They do not think we should be living in a world in which these things are happening, which means that they do think we should be living in a world in which they're not happening. Well, how to create that world?
One of our biggest difficulties is very often in emergency situation, in crisis situation, that politics enter the humanitarian space.
Chaos is very good for extremists across ideologies, and they are exploiting the chaos.
Why can't we have pluralistic societies? Why can't we reshape what identity means? Why does this ethno-nationalism have to keep rearing its head? It's a frightening indictment of how stupid we are and how cowardly we are.
These pathogens keep emerging with great frequency and regularity, and yet we get surprised. Might that be different the next time around?
My hope is that this recognition that all of us are in this together will change the way we do things.
Perhaps the ethical argument combined with fear of another pandemic would be enough to bring about the widespread sweeping changes that we need.
If you look at the statistics, you get depressed. If you look at the people, you have hope. As long as people in need are showing courage, resilience, determination, entrepreneurialism, what right do we have to give up on them?
As the first of the voices you heard there of our new colleague, Ibrahim Kendi, pointed out, this is not just about, this is about policy. A lot of what we are seeing, the concerns, the divisions, the lack of a pluralistic society that was talked about, does come from policy, and those are the type of things we want to talk about. Let me go straight to maybe Tim Longman. Tim is a professor of political science here, a professor of international relations, but also a past and currently interim director of our African Studies Center and the director of our Institute on Religion and World Affairs, CURA. So has been looking at these things from various angles. Tim, when you look at the world, what do you see?
One of the things that's really struck me, even before COVID over the past couple of years, is the degree to which things like democracy are not just institutional, but values as well. Freedom House came out with a special report this week on the impact of the COVID crisis on democracy around the world, and found that 80 countries have seen a decline in democracy over the past year, and only one, Malawi, has seen an improvement in its democratic ranking. This is a trend that's been going on for 15 years, as we've had the rise of not just politicians who are more authoritarian, but popular movements that are supporting authoritarianism. And so one of the things that has really struck me is the degree to which it isn't enough just to have good constitutions, but we actually have to be teaching people the values of democratic engagement, the values of systems representing people, the value of human rights. And that's really something that has been in decline. Huntington wrote about the third wave of democracy that began in the mid-1970s and then swept across Southern Europe and then through Latin America. We had the fall of communism and then swept across Africa. And then finally, you had the Arab Spring beginning 2011. Since then, we've seen a decline. And I think that's a decline not just in institutions, but in the respect that people have for the protection of rights, for respecting diverse voices, for thinking across boundaries and the ways we're connected as a world. So I think that's what really concerns me now. And the question is, when are we going to start on the fourth wave of democracy? When are we going to start to see things like Black Lives Matter helping to drive greater democracy within the United States, which in our own country has been declining in recent years?
And this is I'll maybe move to Rachel next. Something that we heard a lot and is now even more obvious. There was a lot of anger because of some of the things that you're saying across the world. The pictures I remember from January were mostly around the world of angry, especially young people. Whether it was Greta on climate, whether it was Chile, whether it was Lebanon, whether it was this country, whether it was Brexit. But a lot of young people being very angry across the world, partly, as Tim mentions, because the state of democracy, I think the young people were saying, is not really giving us what you promised in the quality of democracy. But building on that or taking it anywhere, Rachel, from your vantage point, and you have a new book that's just come out on looking on women and development in particular, any thoughts of what you have seen through this period, but also see ahead?
Yeah, thank you so much. It's an honor to be here with everyone. And I guess I would say there are three things. Thank you, Adela, and really in response to what Tim has just brought up. So the first, inequality, we know from these images of anger and frustration, it's far more destructive than I think we gave it credit for or we feared. And so we see that, we had Ibram X. Kendi's talking about the disparities and the impact of police violence. We also see it right now with COVID-19 fatality rates. Age-adjusted rates say that people of color in the United States have fatality rates that are 2.5 to 3.6 times higher than self-ascribed white individuals. We see that in terms of invisibility, people actually withdrawing from the state out of fear that they'll be persecuted. And therefore, state resources, things that are there, are underutilized as a result. We see that in a sense of a false sense of invulnerability that elites have. And I think you don't have to look far to see that. Elites who have been insulated from structural violence, which is racism, poverty, insecurity in daily life. And I think we also see it in the sense of there's an isolation from fundamental norm changes. So the world is changing. These links of solidarity are growing. So we know 61% of Americans today think there's too much inequality in the country. And yet, we don't actually see institutions changing in response to common demands. So I guess what I would end on right now is just to say, there are two things that give me hope about where we are. And the first is this recognition that common resources are fundamental. We know at the edges, we're start to talk in the US and elsewhere much more seriously about universal health care, about also thinking about progressive taxation as something we can't avoid. But we're also, as Rachel Nolan had mentioned, we have to look at migration as something that requires not just a reactive response, but proactive changes in institutions. And so if I were to say, the final thing at the moment, this notion of moving from building walls to building wells, I think that's something we all are starting to recognize needs to be done. And I hope this panel is one of those moments where we think about how to do that better.
Thank you. I love the idea of build from walls to wells. And one of the things I think, as especially the COVID moment started, there was a lot of talk, well, this impacts everyone. And then people who study this thing, people like all of you, start saying, well, not really, or not really in the same way. The pathogen might. But what happens to you because of pathogen? Who works from home and who stands on the grocery line bagging my grocery is a very different question. How those impacts come are very different question, both internationally, but also domestically. And a lot of this, again, linking to what Tim had said about the quality of democracy, maybe I should bring it to Mike Woldemariam, and you especially have been looking at Africa, but also other parts of the world, because we have in some ways also started getting more parochial about things we are seeing and not always noticing how they're happening in many places. But Mike, from your vantage point, what do you see in terms of societal or political societal change, if you will?
Yeah, thanks, Adel. And maybe I'll pick up on the theme of Africa and sort of democracy and human rights on the continent. Of course, Tim and I share research interests on the African continent. I agree with much of what he's already said. I mean, I think one thing to understand about the impact of COVID in this area is to actually look at what the trends were in Africa right before COVID hit, right? So I think we were at a moment across the continent. Obviously, it's 54 countries. It's a large continent. One can't really generalize, but where there was a significant amount of democratic backsliding, and a lot of the gains in democratization, human rights on the continent that were achieved at the end of the Cold War were beginning to be diminished, right? And so, and initially I had thought, well, perhaps COVID, we've got a number of countries where authoritarianism is on the march. Maybe COVID will disrupt that sort of trajectory. But I think it is the case that authoritarianism across the continent has, by and large, with some exceptions, been empowered by COVID-19, and human rights consequently have been diminished. And I think there's, this plays out in a variety of different ways depending on the country we're talking about. I mean, I think incumbents have invoked emergency powers in some countries. Elections have been delayed in other contexts. In some instances where a new date for the election hasn't even been announced. I think in some instances, social movements and the opposition, political opposition, has been effectively demobilized. A lot of it because of COVID-related restrictions on organizing imposed by governments, but also some of it is just self-regulation. Social movements and individuals are not going to behave the same way in terms of organizing in a COVID world where you've got this contagious disease. And I think part of the reason this has been, COVID has empowered authoritarians in Africa is that COVID hasn't actually been the disaster for incumbent governments that we thought it might have been early on. I mean, there was a lot of talk early on in the trajectory of this pandemic that Africa would be hit hard. Africa doesn't have ventilators, poor public health systems, all the rest of it. But we've seen quite a bit of governmental resilience and societal resilience as well, and we could get into why that's the case. Now, of course, again, there are some countries where, for incumbent governments, things have been kind of catastrophic, and we got a case in Burundi, where an incumbent president passed away from COVID. And so, but broadly speaking, I do think authoritarianism is on the march and human rights are suffering.
Thank you on that. And I should also mention Mike Woldemariam is the incoming director of Boston University's Africa Studies Center, which he will be directing as of next year. And that leads me in some ways to the director of our Center for Latin American Studies, Adela Panetta, who also works on literature and the idea of values, Adela. In some ways, I want to take this conversation to not just where we are, but where do we go? What is the role of values as societies build them? You know, I was struck in that video with Zayed Al-Hussein saying, why can't we have pluralistic societies? And so the question in my mind is also, how do they come about and what is the role of values in them? And you are mute, so please, yes.
Thank you, Adil. Yes, I was just thinking of what Tim said about the impasse in which we find ourselves. You know, the state is many states in Africa and elsewhere have been incapable of dealing with a crisis like COVID, but social movements, some of them have also gone to the extreme right. In the videos we saw, we also heard a professor talking about chaos as one of the problems in instilling a democratic system and a more egalitarian society. And Tim also mentioned, well, we need to center on values and how the challenge is, who is the one who is going to tell us what values are? And values from which sense and to whom? Particularly because we live in a global society with many different systems, social customs, cultures. So I think this is a very complex situation. Sociologist Sigmund Bauman talked about our times as that of a liquid modernity. He said 100 years ago, to be modern meant to chase the final state of perfection. Now it means an infinity of improvement, but with no final state in sight and non-desired in some cases. So in this sense, I think literature and art might be a solution. Why? I think of literature in the broader sense, not in relation to the printing press, which gave rise to letter culture. I mean literature as the core of human beings being able to tell stories, because telling stories means to share experience. And only when we share experience, we can understand the other. Let's think of Sherazad in 1001 Nights. Because she knew so many stories, she managed to save all the maidens of the kingdom, and she managed to also bring her wisdom to the readers. I give you some examples in Latin American literature. We learn about the decline or the problems with the Spanish Empire through the lens of a lunatic, Don Quixote. We learn the terrible example of extractive economies, robber extraction in Latin America through the lens of slaves, robber slaves. We learn about patriarchal society through the lens of a stone in a very amazing novel by Elena Garros, who is a Mexican writer. Flaubert once says that he was Madame Bovary. This was taken as a gender appropriation, as a male arrogance. But to say something in his favor, I would also quote Borges. Borges said, Borges and I am not Borges. Borges belongs to language and Borges belongs to the world. If we read books, we are going to be less lonely. Tim also said that young people are capable of joining extremist groups because we are in front of a computer all alone and because we don't see a path to a better future. I think stories, and we listen to other stories, and I said at the beginning that literature is not the answer if we just think of the print medium, is because now we live the decline of print culture, but it doesn't mean that we should live the decline of sharing stories. We recently had at BU a film called Border South, where we listened to the stories of the migrants crossing the US-Mexico border. The protagonist was an anthropologist. He was collecting material culture, objects left by the many dead in the border. But that really struck us in this film was to hear the stories of these migrants. These stories were not very different to ours. These were people who have a life, they do the same as we do. They have dreams, they want to have a better life. So only when we share stories, we probably can make a better world.
That is wonderful. And maybe that is the question we are all talking about. What are the stories that we will tell about this time to future times, and how will that impact our actions? In some ways, I do wonder, will we be telling the story of Zoom? Is that all that this moment will reduce to, or will we be telling the story of the demand for democracy, of Black Lives Matter, of social unrest, of discovering that frontline workers mean something else? That there are people around us who we have not cared for, without whom we cannot continue the way we do. So maybe that's my big question, but I'll come back to Tim to take it.
Can I jump into something? Which is one of the things that strikes me is that progressive forces need to really step up their storytelling, as it were. I think that over the past few years, nationalistic forces, conservative forces have developed a very compelling narrative that people outside your own country and your own racial group are a threat to you. That various social groups, the women's advances are a threat to men, that the advances of people of color are a threat to white people, that LGBTQ rights is a threat to the general public. All these sorts of narratives have become very appealing. And I think we're seeing with things like the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, with various protest movements that have happened, that there are attempts to really bring a more progressive narrative. But I think that's something we need to focus on, is how do we make our values of democracy, our values of human rights, our values of inclusiveness appealing to a wider population? How do we convince straight white men in the industrial part of the Midwest of the United States to realize that equality actually benefits them, not just other groups? And I think that's something that we as academics can work on. We can tell stories much better than we do.
I want to stay with you. I want to say one thing, though, to those who are watching us, and I'll come to you, Mike, in a second. Please, if you have questions, post them early. We can all look at those questions. We'll try to incorporate them. So in the chat function, please ask your questions. I was going to say something, but I know Mike wants to jump in, so he gets.
And then I'll jump in after that.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm not, I hope this is a productive intervention, sort of building on some of Tim's comments. I mean, one thing that I've observed in Africa that I find quite interesting is the way in which, in the COVID era, the continent has really jumped into, or made itself part of sort of this sort of transnational field or transnational kind of discourse on human rights struggles. And I mean, Africa's been part of a transnational discourse on human rights struggles before, but oftentimes it's been the object of attention, right? And now you see Africa and Africans through social media and other mechanisms weighing into human rights struggles in other parts of the world in really fascinating ways. I mean, there was a lot of, you look at social media, there was a lot of attention to the struggle for racial justice in the United States, to the point where, the African Union responded basically to popular demand by saying something, issuing a statement of concern about what was going on with police violence against people of color, Black people in the United States. So too, we know that China is a really important economic player in Africa. When we had, African students and workers that were targeted for, through discriminatory actions in China, that was like 6-7 months ago. Again, you saw a lot of uproar on social media. And I thought that was really interesting. I'm not sure if the observation contributes to the discussion, but there's a way in which, and I don't know if it's because COVID makes this transnational discourse a little bit more possible, but Africans really engaging in the rights struggles of other parts of the world.
Rachel?
Yeah, so I mean, I think I'd like to try to bring the question of our individual values back to our collective resources, because I think one of the things that maybe goes underemphasized is just how much more vulnerable most of the world is becoming. And so I think part of this, to go back to Tim's point about the ease with which people are mobilized to look at outsiders as the problem, whether that's geographic outsiders or people of a different race, or whatever it might be. And I think there's also a material reason for that, which is within the structures in which there was some kind of prior support, that many of those structures are breaking down. So to take it back to the US, if you looked 3 decades ago, 20% of workers were covered by unions. Today, that's 6%. That's not to say that unions are 100% of the answer. They've been also exclusionary, and we're very likely to exclude women. We're very likely to exclude new immigrants, but they differentially protected Black Americans. And so, and even today, even if we're only talking 6% of the population that's covered, those who are covered by unions earn 25% more on average than those without them. So as we see, you know, whether it's globalization that's motivated from outside or from within, we do see some of these institutions of solidarity being discarded. And I think we have to work harder to figure out how we protect our most vulnerable populations. That's within countries as well as climate migrants, which are projected at the higher end to be up to 1 billion climate migrants by 2050. And so I think it's not enough to look to our inward to see what we can do, but I think we also need to look outward and really work to fundamentally transform institutions.
One of the thoughts that has struck me during recent days, but even slightly before COVID, is in this connected age, things that may seem very local do get global legs because they empower others. Right? We saw that in some ways with the Arabs, the so-called Arab Spring. We can talk about whether that was a good term or not, but we also saw that with Me Too. We are seeing that with Black Lives Matter, that these movements, even if they become about something else, elsewhere, because of the connectedness, there is a sense, I can raise my voice too, right? We saw this even with Greta on climate. The question really, and anyone can take this, is to build on what you know. So Tim says we need new narratives. Adela says those narratives can come from literature. Mike says those narratives may already be beginning. But more on where will these narratives come from? Who can do what?
Can I say something about what Tim and Rachel say? I think there are two issues when we talk about narratives. It's like the narrative itself and the medium. Marshall McLuhan once says that the medium is the message. And what's happening nowadays is that technological advances have atomized the way we communicate. And I think because also speed is a factor, this is why also social movements rise and then all of a sudden collapse. We have a huge power of assembly, but also a huge power of fragmentation. And the question would be, is this ingrained in media? Or is it the way we manage media? So that's one question. About narratives, I think what Tim says is very interesting. Why the extreme right is capable of conveying messages that are more efficient in their political agendas with many people. Maybe it's because there are more connected to certain mythologies of nation-building projects, or maybe because they connect economic factors with symbolic ones. And I think you know, these are two important issues. somebody asks if we don't think progressive voices are silenced and that they don't have space. So this might be a question about big media versus informal media. So I don't know if voices are silenced, but I don't know if inequality is going to be solved by us telling stories. That was not my point. My point was that if we tell stories and give them a stage, then maybe we can start having at least more impact in systems.
And Adela just mentioned this excellent question that Pamela Hanrahan just asked on the chat, which is, aren't progressive voices being silenced? And maybe a thought as we think about it is, if they are they also not finding new ways to be not silenced? Is what we are seeing on the streets, on social media and so on and so forth, not also a reaction to that? But for progressive as well as maybe non-progressive. But hold that thought, if you will, and let us maybe, as we think about Pamela's question, if you allow me one more 2-minute clip on what some of our other experts are saying about how life itself is being changed by the moment we are in, giving both new challenges and new opportunities.
There will not be a single sector of society untouched by this pandemic. There will not be a single activity that goes on as it once did.
We'll see disparities emerge among those who are connected and those who are not. Being disconnected in the world of COVID was bad. Being disconnected after the world of COVID will be worse.
I think one thing that COVID has done is it's brought technology into spaces where it never was before.
As a result of COVID-19, we're going to have robots everywhere. Everywhere.
I think every business will be a digital business.
Zoom has become a verb. The question is how this will change our working lives.
This whole notion of work from home, while it's been really good for a lot of people, I do think we need to be very cautious and pay a lot of attention to what's happening in particular for women.
Is every university going to become Zoom university in the future?
I think we can be really clear and say that global higher education will change profoundly, and I do think it will change forever.
This is going to be a long-term recovery effort, trying to rebuild cities in a way that emphasizes health, safety, inclusivity, justice, and resilience. That's where I think we have to go.
I hope that literature could give us the logic and the feeling to really strive for communitarian bonds.
This moment is helping us realize how important and key and necessary the arts are to our very core being.
I think more people will appreciate the primacy of public health as the undergirding of our civil society.
We have an opportunity here to break down the barriers that continue to haunt our discussion about mental health.
There are things that could be done. There's no reason why we can't rise to the level of other developed countries and indeed many underdeveloped ones and introduce a humane system of universal health care.
Epidemics bring out the worst and the best in people. People become threatened, they become worried. But then there are people who see a fire and they take a bucket and they run towards it. Epidemics at least give us hope that there is this higher level that we can all aspire to.
And maybe on this exact last thought from Nahid Bhadelia, and we have this excellent question from Julia Clark, one of our alumni, as well as a member of the Dean's Advisory Board, and we're delighted to have her here, asks about sort of polarization, right? Polarization is on everyone's mind. In some ways, and it's part of the discomfort that are we tearing apart so much that well that Rachel talked about, or the bridge that could have been built, can no longer be. So how do we get there? Tim, thoughts from you. Is this moment dividing us so much technologically, in other ways, societally, that we are beyond sort of healing or coming together at some other better place?
I think that this panel is focused on values. And I think one of the things that we've seen is that we can't always depend on our institutions. And I think there are lots of ways in which our societies have come together, in which people have helped one another. And I think there are ways in which much of the world has come together and tried to work together and solve problems. I think the US is a bit odd in this case, in that we've really pulled away from the rest of the world. We've not been participating, we've not been cooperating. But if you stop looking at our own case and look at the rest of the world, I think there actually has been a pretty high level of cooperation that has not been based on ideological lines. And so I actually think that there has been ways in which people around the world have helped one another. Governments have sometimes connected, but I do think there is hope in that. So I'm embarrassed that my own country has been perhaps the worst example around the world of this, that we've had politicians who have polarized people and made the epidemic itself a political conflict. But I think that's actually not been the case in most of the world. I was actually in Congo as the crisis was just breaking in early March. And I was amazed at how quickly protections were instituted and how the population immediately started preparing. They'd gone through the Ebola crisis fairly recently. And so they were prepared, and the population really pulled together. Government gave some directives, people followed them. It wasn't challenged. It was not done in an authoritarian way. And I think that's the kind of thing that can give us a lot of hope.
And especially, I think also at a community level, we've seen sort of, as we've been forced to sort of confine, we actually recognize our immediate neighbors much more simply by that fact. And I think that was one of those things. But Rachel, if I can jump to you, there was the mention there, and something that I think many people have thought about is also the disparate different impacts on women. And we talk about that in this country, but also across the world. Any thoughts on that? And again, lessons that take us to a better place.
Sure. Yeah. Well, to start from looking backwards, if we look back just a year, the World Bank estimated that we have a $160 trillion loss due simply to the fact that women earn less than men. And so gender inequality has been an extremely common facet of modern history, at least since the Industrial Revolution. And so I do think, there's a pessimistic and an optimistic view about what COVID-19 is going to do to gender inequality. The pessimistic view is very much looking at the present. So today, if you look at who bears a disproportionate cost to the insecurity and the shrinking of economies around the world, it's women. Women are losing jobs at faster rates than men, whether you look in the US, where women actually have been the majority of the workforce in the recent past, or you look to the other extreme on the spectrum, you look to India, women are still 20% more likely to conditional on having been in the labor force to lose their job due to COVID. And this is different than past crises where men are more likely to lose their jobs. So we've just seen as slowly women creeping up to something that looks more equal when it comes to labor force participation, and that is changing before our eyes. Women are much more likely, on average, globally, 70% of frontline workers are women, and so not only are they losing their jobs at higher rates than men, they're also much more exposed to this particular health crisis than men are. And what looks to be the case is because women tend to bear the majority of the burden of care in households, women are also voluntarily retreating from the labor force in order to make sure that care happens for those who really need it. And that's predicted to those disproportionate losses of access to income are likely to last for quite a while. The positive view outlook is what people call the second order effective crisis, which is as people have retreated to the household, all of the labor of care that women traditionally do has become much, much more evident to men in households. And there is some, it does look like from some household surveys that men are starting to do some work. It's still not equal, but that burden is something that has now started to be considered as a shared burden, not just a female burden. And so the hope is that in the long term, we do see the institutions of the family start to shift, such that there is more of an egalitarian understanding that care is everyone's work. And to the extent that institutions can actually help subsidize the burden of care and enable people to provide care and still to carry on with jobs and careers, then I think we have a reason for optimism going forward.
I think all of those are extremely important points, including this idea of the institution of the family. There is a focus, not just as a platitude, but okay, what is the shared responsibility of community at large? As we sort of get into the second half and move towards conclusion, I do want to push the conversation to, okay, what next? One of the things that a number of people have sort of pointed out, including many economists, is that moments of crisis can change values big ways. Right? The Second World War in some ways hastened women in the workplace in a number of parts of the world, changed the pace at which decolonization might have happened without it maybe, and so on and so forth. What type of things can we imagine in terms of values, either the processes by which they may morph because of this or values themselves? Tim.
Ways values may change. Yeah, I mean, I think they generally change slowly. We do note that big events, a Great Depression, a world war can shake things up. And it's certainly possible, when we look at our own president receiving fantastic socialized medicine right now at a government facility, you wonder if that isn't going to shake up how people think about getting your medical care from the government, and to see that it's certainly possible that could happen. So I one of the areas I work on a lot is religion, and I think there has been a challenge to religious institutions in recent years. The Catholic Church has gone through an international crisis related to sexual abuse. There have been, I think, a lot of criticism in the Islamic world of extremism that's had a big voice there. And yet there is some sense that a lot of people have actually turned to religion in the context of the COVID crisis for meaning, for understanding, for connection with other people. So, we may see some changes coming out of this. It may be, some of them may not be great changes. Some of them actually may be negative changes, but there's a possibility that there can be greater connections to people, greater empathy, greater support for policies that could prevent this kind of crisis in the future.
Adela?
Yes, I just wanted to say something about the idea of the family and how the family has to be reshaped. And I just think about my generation and the generation that came later and my students, and I think big changes have happened already on the question of gender. Gender relations have been transformed completely, and also because of economic reasons. Young people have become more used to precariousness, and I don't think this is a good thing. But I see that they adapt much better to a world in flux than we did. They have learned to think faster, to move faster, to not be afraid of insecurity, of social insecurity. I don't think this should be the path for the future. I think we have to envision a different. I don't think we can separate the question of values from the question of politics and economics. They are completely tied, and I think this conversation shows that. But the problem is who or what type of values systems can actually ground in such a fluid society. The question of media and how media will shape our future, if we are going to become a zombie society, you know, connected to technological devices instead of talking to people, that we don't know, or at least I don't know, but I don't think we should fear that. I think we should trust the young people, and we should think that they are teaching us how they are adapting to the circumstances that we are living right now.
Michael, if I can come back to you, we had started off with talking about democracy, and we thought of, you know, what do you see in terms of what people will demand of democracy, not just what leaders might do, but in this, but any thoughts on generally on that area?
Well, I think across the world, but particularly in the African context, I mean, the demand for democracy will persist. Particularly when we take the long view. I mean, I think, you know, if you take a short-term perspective, it's certainly true that that social movements have been, and I said this before, demobilized by the pandemic. And, you know, people are focused on daily struggles, right? Daily struggles over bread, livelihood. You know, the pandemic has had a big economic impact across African countries. When we look at, you know, the fact that the continent, you know, many African economies are driven by exports, and the demand for African exports around the world has been reduced. So, I mean, that's a significant issue. But I think the demand for democracy will persist. You know, on the subject of, you know, sort of social values and changing social values. I mean, one other subject I wanted to bring in is just, you know, the way in which people's views or perspectives on the role of the state itself may actually shift. I mean, Africa's in an interesting place on this particular question. And I think a lot of this applies to the United States as well. I mean, you know, when at the end of the Cold War, as we moved into the 1990s with the Washington Consensus, you know, the role of the state in core service provision was diminished across the continent. And it was the African family, nuclear extended, that filled that gap, civil society. I mean, core areas like public health, like education. And I do think that one thing that will change with COVID is, and it's already begun to change, is that people actually recognize the core function that government provides in the context of just governance. And, you know, I think coronavirus, COVID-19 highlights that role for everyone. And so I do think we will see a secular change in that direction. Sort of more sort of pro-state solutions to different societal challenges. I'll leave it there.
Yeah. And what you were talking about is something that in the comment section, the question section, our colleague Esther, who had also pointed out sort of what is happening to authoritarianism, what is happening to what might happen. But I'll open this to anyone, and anyone can please jump in. But I read the comments and questions we are getting, and also maybe the pulse of the time. There is also seems to be a lot of desire to bring people together. To create those to use this moment to create a new set of values. I mean, I somehow feel that here in this country with Black Lives Matter, you know, you see the intensity of the idea and the acceptance of the idea, and you hope, okay, I hope this one is the one that will bring that big change. Is that a hope that we are just sort of wanting to cling to, or do you guys see sort of the possibility of these value changes that Tim reminds us are slow, and that also create the counter movements to stop them always? Rachel, you had your hand up.
Yeah, so on this very point of, I know that there's been a few questions about, is the fact of increasing polarization, should that diminish our hope that we can reach a consensus around an agenda for transformation? And I would say I'm very hopeful by the fact that we do see counter movements. Backlash makes me extremely hopeful because it gives me some hope that people realize there's a real force, there's a critical mass of people that believe that things need to change, from the ground level political institutions of the household or the family up to the highest level of what democracy means and how we implement it. And so to me, the fact that we do see far right movements, as we see an emergence and I think a much greater support for far left or center left movements, to me this suggests people realize things have to change. And the question now is, how will they change? And whose voices will be the ones that actually affect the institutions that govern our lives. And I don't think this is an easy movement of change, but to answer your question, I'm optimistic.
Tim?
I think that one of the things we need to do is think about a sort of middle ground narrative, as Adela was talking about. I think there are lots of ways in which Fukuyama wrote about the end of history, that basically liberal democracy won, and now 20 years later, or 30 years later, it seems like that particular approach is bankrupt. That you've had a growth in the extremes, and what we're really lacking now is a vision of how we come together, how we move forward in a way that is, center left, center, that draws in things. And I think you look at the growing support for violent answers on both left and right, and realize that, well, what we need is an articulation of something that brings people, that is appealing, that is not about violence, that is not about dividing, but is about unifying, about crossing borders, about joining together. I think you get nationalist movements on the left, nationalist movements on the right, and I think there's a cosmopolitanism that we could be arguing for that could be very attractive. But I don't think that narrative has yet emerged effectively at an elite level. I think that the masses are perhaps showing us the way. I think there is an extraordinary amount of activism. You see the young people and people who are not college professors and such leading marches in ways that are really inspiring. And I think we need to look at that and say, okay, what are we drawing from this that can inspire us?
Adela?
Yes, I completely agree, but I also would like to go back to the point that Michael made about the role of the state when facing a crisis like COVID. And I think the case he pointed out in Africa is also the case in Latin America. There you can see how some states have manipulated COVID politically, but you also see how many people don't trust the state just mainly because they are afraid of losing their jobs, or they trust the public hospitals because they think people are going to die there. And this lack of certainty between individuals, communities, and the state is a symptom. And COVID has brought this to the fore. And I do believe that we can organize. There is in ourselves to help each other, but we do need to think of the role of the state in moments like this. I am not a political scientist. I don't know about this, but it's clear to me from my perspective that it's something that we should think about.
And as we sort of move towards ending this, there is a lot of change that you and others are identifying as possible change. And I think the point about the state that Adela made, Michael made, states recognize that. And in some ways, some of their reaction may actually be because they recognize that their space is shrinking. One thing we haven't talked about is the changing nature of work. Which might impact people at a very immediate level and create both new opportunities, but also new challenges, and certainly an upheaval that we are already seeing, not just in this country, but across the world in good and bad ways. So as we move, maybe a last set of round, maybe one or two, but I want to pick up on the idea of the stories we will tell. Anyone can start. What is your best hope of what the story will be that we will tell or others will teach in the classes you teach, 10, 15, 20 years from now, about the possibility of what could have happened in this moment? I know it's a big, broad issue, but as we conclude both this panel and this sort of crash course on the future, if you had that wish, what would be the stories you would want people to be telling about how this moment was used? Rachel?
Yeah, I mean, I would say I hope the story will be This is a moment where we collectively invested in resilience. And to do so, we realized that our countries, our societies, our communities are only as strong as the weakest individuals and their opportunities. And so we invested in ensuring mobility from whether we're talking about the bottom of the economic ladder or the ladder of social status or the ladder of political influence. And we said, we are not going to tolerate lack of voice, lack of visibility, lack of hope. And this is the time where we invested in ensuring that the most vulnerable people going forward would be people who had hope, who had voice, who had agency. And to do that, it means, as Adela has been saying, fundamentally changing the institutions of the state to make that a reality.
Mike Woldemariam, what are the stories you would want to be told?
It's a tough question. I mean, I guess I would mention two things. I mean, one, I hope this is, going back to the issue of polarization. I mean, I hope this is a moment where I hope we historically, as we look back on this, I hope we see this as a critical juncture where we walk back from the brink on polarization, particularly in the context of this country, and we're able to find a more unifying politics that brings us all together. I mean, I think it could go either way at this point, to be honest. And then the second thing is that I hope COVID-19 signifies to us that our problems are truly global, that we're interconnected, and that we need global solutions to many of the world's challenges today, and that being in our national silos simply is not enough. I mean, COVID-19, if anything, I think teaches us that, right? So that's what I'd say.
I love both of those stories, but I must confess, I listen to them and I think, okay, those are stories that I don't see happening right now. Maybe that's why we want them to be the stories. We see economic disparity increasing in this moment, not decreasing. We see even this single most global moment of our life. We spoke to David Miliband and he dramatically said, where is the global reaction? There is no global reaction. Right? We see silos and walls going up rather than wells being dug or bridges being built. But I don't want to be the cynic here because I do share those hopes. But I want to listen to Tim. What would the stories, Tim, that you would want to be written about in the future?
I think when we look back, we'll see this as a time when the young people led us. I think it gets overlooked. When I was in Congo in February and March, one of the things that struck me is how little the people in the country were noticing that their political dynamism in recent years have been driven by youth movements, young people who've been organizing creative protests and finding new ways to gain attention and to challenge those in power, and actually forced an election that the government didn't want to hold. In the United States, we look at Black Lives Matter and who's driving it. Well, it's a disparate group. There's not a single leader. There's no longer a Martin Luther King or a Malcolm X. There's many, many people, and many of them are young, and they're driving things forward. And I think this is true in many parts of the world. If you go back to the Arab Spring, it was young people. And I think as elders, we tend to discount that. We see it as less serious, less important. They're easily influenced. They're vulnerable. And yet, I think when we look back on this era, what we'll see, if there are positive changes, that's where they will have come from.
Very, very, very right. Adela, since you started us off on the story,
I would say two things. First, there would be the stories that help us think philosophically about the moment in which we are. And those stories could tackle the questions of if we can actually lead the destinies of the human race or not. If there are major systems that actually take decisions for us that are immanent in technological advancement. If we cannot actually take decisions that are going to change the world, that's one. But from the subjective point of view, the stories I really like and inspire me are those who show me that other human beings, regardless of how poor and how in desperate situations they are, the spark of life shines and teach me something. I don't want to feel pity for the other. I want to feel respect for the other. And this film that I saw last week show me that. The stories we heard about the immigrants crossing the border were stories about their ingenuity, their intelligence, their craft of being able to do something in life. And I think this is something that we also learn from young people, as Tim say, and the hope is there. And there is no solution or no universal value. There is only flux, as we say at the beginning, but we should keep critical thinking and also empathy.
Thank you. Thank you. Those are all wonderful stories. Thank you, everyone, for your time, for your wonderful thoughts. I hope those who are listening now, those who will listen to this in recording, will take from this idea that whatever the stories are, we'll have to tell them. I really do agree with Tim that the most important stories of this time will be told by the young. I was recently the lead author for the National Youth Report, or Human Development Report on Youth for Pakistan. And the headline of that was that good, bad, ugly, the future of that country depends on those who are between 13 and 29 today. And I think that's not just true for Pakistan. In a way, this is not about sort of just passing on the buck. This is not just a way of passing on the responsibility to the youth. I don't even know if this is actually wishing them well, because this is a big responsibility. But the stories of this time will indeed, I think, be told by the young, and I hope those will be better stories than my generation have been constructing in at least recent years. But thank you all on the panel. Thank you all who are listening. All of these panels are available in recording at the Pardee School website. Keep telling the stories. Keep writing better stories for all of our futures. Thank you.
Thank you, Adel, and thank you to everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you. Take care.